And I will definitely love to share my screen as you mentioned.
Absolutely. Absolutely. I made you co-host, so you should see a little green upward arrow at the little bar at the bottom. Awesome. Thank you.
It's okay.
Yes, that looks perfect. Thank you.
Yeah, so thank you so much for the opportunity to come back and present. I know I talked about this, I don't know, gosh, probably 2 years ago or so. So this is exciting to kind of come back around and see where things ended up. So in terms of disclosures, the research that I'm about to show you was funded by NHLBI, and I'm also the founder and CEO of Pulmonary Health, as I just mentioned. And I wanted to start off by thanking all of our collaborators that put this study together. So there's a lot of people, obviously my team, but a lot of folks at Atrium and Wake Forest, which is now merged into the Atrium Health Wake Forest Baptist group. We also had folks from the Duke University and West Virginia, and then some consultants, including Grace Ann Dorney Koppel. So I wanted to just start with this concept, and for us to just kind of think about this as it relates to pulmonary rehab. So I'm sure everybody's seen these images before where, equality and equity, and then they've recently added a new one, fair and just. And so the CDC says that that in terms of equal treatment and availability of healthcare for all people, that's achieved when each person or group is given the same resources or opportunities. But equity is when everyone has, when we take into account different factors such as employment, housing, transportation, education, so socioeconomic status, et cetera, to help people to achieve better health. And then I think with this third one, the fair and just, is really when we start to remove those obstacles to help people gain access to health and healthcare. So I put that as kind of the basis for the basic premise for the virtual pulmonary rehab program. And again, I know I'm preaching to the choir a little bit here with what the problem is, but let's just go through it really quickly. We know COPD is third leading cause of death, 6 in the US. There's 15 million people with it, about 17% of the Medicare population, and 1 death every 4 minutes. It's an enormously costly disease, costing about $50 billion per year, with the majority of those costs, almost $30 billion, being direct healthcare costs. And again, the majority of that's paid for by Medicare and Medicaid. So it's a huge burden. And we know that a lot of those costs come from exacerbations and readmissions. And so we know that pulmonary rehab can help reduce that. Most effective treatment for COPD is pulmonary rehab, and it can have a lifetime net cost savings of almost $6,000. But the problem is that 97% of people with COPD don't get it. And it's worse in other countries. So for example, in Canada, less than 0.5% actually gets pulmonary rehab. And we also know that pulmonary rehab is not only beneficial for COPD, but also other lung diseases, as it's been shown to improve exercise, functional capacity symptoms, results in fewer hospitalizations due to exacerbations. There's a reduction in healthcare utilization, improves muscle capacity and efficiency, reduces fatigue, breathlessness, and increases in exercise tolerance and physical function and disease self-management. It also recently, back in 2020, Peter Lindenauer and colleagues published a really important paper that reviewed nearly 200,000 Medicare beneficiaries that were hospitalized for an exacerbation. And he was interested in exploring the benefit of pulmonary rehab on mortality. And he wondered if pulmonary rehab started within the first 90 days after discharge, if people had if that had a different impact on mortality than if pulmonary rehab was started after 90 days or not at all. And he found that the adults receiving early pulmonary rehab had a mortality rate of less than 10%, whereas those receiving pulmonary rehab after 90 days or not at all had a mortality rate of nearly 20%. And he also noticed, importantly, that for every 3 additional sessions that there was that significantly lowered the risk of death. But again, he found that only 1.5% of people hospitalized for COPD actually got pulmonary rehab within the first 90 days. And so these results really reinforce the importance of developing alternative strategies for increasing participation in pulmonary rehab. Using the same database, our collaborator, Chris Mosier from Duke, compared the estimated effects of post-hospitalization pulmonary rehab on cost. And he actually figured out that a single 2-hour session of pulmonary rehab costs about $111. That's including reimbursement and copay. And if you multiply that by the 36 sessions, the cost of pulmonary rehab is about around $4,000. And he concluded that even if the cost of pulmonary rehab increased to $171 per session, there's still a cost savings due to lower hospitalizations. And he also posited that if the 200,000 patients that were hospitalized for exacerbation had received pulmonary rehab, that CMS would see a cost savings of over $1 billion each year. So again, the pulmonary rehab is such a good thing, but so few people are getting it. And there's a lot of reasons for that. So there's a huge underutilization of pulmonary rehab. And this was a really nice paper published by Jones back in 2018. And he sort of, or I'm not sure actually if Jones is male or female, but divided it into a couple of different areas. I'm not going to go through each of these domains, but I want to call out a couple of them. So in terms of refers, there's often long waiting times for pulmonary rehab. In terms of patients, there's transport accessibility issues. And then in terms of the whole healthcare system, there's lack of flexibility of pulmonary rehab, and there's everybody's dealing with staffing issues. So let's look at the areas where we did the study. So we did the study both in North Carolina and West Virginia. And in North Carolina, there's over 500,000 people living with COPD in North Carolina. These are the clinics that are listed on the AACVPR's website. So perhaps there's a few more clinics, but I'm pretty sure this is the vast majority of them. And so this ends up being about one clinic for every 14,000 plus patients. And a quick, call to some of these clinics, we found that most clinics see about 300 to 400 patients per year. That means that just to reach the people that are alive today, it would take somewhere between, 40 to 50 years to reach the people alive today at that rate. Also, when we look at where these pulmonary rehab clinics are located, so the colors on this map are the prevalence of COPD. The darker the color, the more people with COPD live in that area. And you can see that the pulmonary rehab programs really cluster in population centers that are away from high burden of disease, except for this one. This cluster does seem to reach a lot of that higher prevalence group. We also looked at the West Virginia community. So there's about 190,000 people living with COPD in West Virginia and about 17 or so clinics. So it's about one clinic for every 11,000 plus patients. And we know that West Virginia does have a high prevalence of COPD throughout, but you can also see that even among the kind of the border cities here is where a lot of the pulmonary rehab clinics are located, and that is moving towards that lower burden area. And so briefly, I'll just cover telehealth and get to the data here. So in terms of telehealth, we know that telehealth is when interventions are provided at a distance using some sort of like telecommunications. So telerehab uses information and communication technologies to provide rehabilitation from a distance. Sometimes it looks like a clinic located in one location can see a patient that might be located actually at a clinic at another location, but it saves the patient having to drive all the way into the center to receive care. But it also may mean that the patient's getting their being seen at home via telehealth. And there's really no one single telehealth pulmonary rehab model, but I want to discuss kind of two ideas briefly. One is what we would call synchronous telepulmonary rehab and an asynchronous or virtual. And that's the model that we used in our study. So let me describe the difference between those two. Noel Cox and the rest of that team from Australia, the Ann Holland's group, published a really comprehensive Cochrane review describing synchronous telerehabilitation. So if you want a great kind of review paper on that, that's a good paper to review. But they suggest that telerehab offers greater access to those who are geographically or socially isolated for whom travel is challenging. And people with COPD are interested in it, they found. And it can contain education and disease management as well as exercise. Some programs tend to really focus a lot on the exercise piece, but we know pulmonary rehab is more than just exercise. And then some of these technologies also give the clinicians feedback in real time. They use real-time telerehab. Also gives you a window into the patient's home, especially if video is being used. So you might be able to take in like what their surroundings are like and potentially address some issues related to that. There's a lot of evidence to suggest that telehealth reaches people without access to clinics and is effective, cost savings, reduces chances for hospitalizations, and increases life expectancy and improves quality of care. So there's a growing body of evidence that synchronous telerehabilitation is really beneficial. We recently published with my colleagues at Wake Forest a review paper that kind of compared telehealth versus other comparators. So in this case, this is telerehab versus clinic-based pulmonary rehab. And as you can see here, all of the studies showed that there was that the outcomes improved in both. Some studies showed that there were no difference in outcomes or that telerehab was not inferior to clinic-based pulmonary rehab, but only one study and one outcome showed that telerehab was inferior. When they looked at telerehab versus no intervention, same thing, where the outcomes showed in general that there was an improvement in telerehab over no intervention at all. And this is the graph on the right is Suryabat's paper that showed that telerehab compared to no intervention also had a significant reduction in all-cause readmissions and COPD-related readmissions. And when we look at telerehab versus no comparison, so just looking at telerehab pre-post, again, we see that the outcomes are improved with the exception of one study. So asynchronous remote therapeutic monitoring pulmonary rehab is when patients are exercising on their own. They're using something like instructional videos or an avatar guided exercise program. So there's no face-to-face interaction with the clinician. And they're monitored in some way using technology from a distance. And so clinicians can track how their patients are doing using that technology. And then they might do a periodic check-in. Usually in most studies, it's a phone call. And the benefit of this style or this model is there's a lot more patient flexibility. So patients don't have to be on a Zoom call at a particular time or join a group at a particular time. They can exercise whenever they want. It's lower cost and there's an opportunity for new revenue generation. But the thing that we want to make sure that we consider is, patient self-motivation and that there's less social engagement with this model. But again, there's research that's starting to accumulate that shows that 8-week unsupervised pulmonary rehab at home does have some benefits. And you can read, some of that here. There was this study in particular showed that there's no difference between the supervised group and the unsupervised group, and most of the outcomes in Neural Cochrane review. She also discusses a sub-analysis of unsupervised pulmonary rehab, and again showing that there's similar outcomes with unsupervised pulmonary rehab. And this paper on the right is a study by Lee, which shows that what they looked at was people who were compliant with the unsupervised program compared to those that were not compliant. Again, getting back to the idea of, this should be for the right motivated patient, but you can see here on a variety of different outcomes, the group that was compliant with their unsupervised home program did better than the non-compliant group. And then Ann Holland's group took it a little farther and said, well, what if we follow these people for 2 years and see where they are at the end of 2 years? And it turns out that actually the unsupervised training group had the least hospitalizations of even over the telehealth versus control. Control was no intervention. But there was a pretty significant difference between the unsupervised training and the control group. And that's a 2-year follow-up. And I really love the conclusion that this paper offers which is for people who don't have access to complete pulmonary rehab, that the long-term tele-rehab or unsupervised training at home represent promising alternatives to traditional pulmonary rehab and maintenance strategies. And that unsupervised training at home could be offered to patients with COPD who don't have access to pulmonary rehab, or could be used during maintenance programs. And it may be useful for patients who are unsuitable. Tele-rehab may be useful for patients who are unsuitable for unsupervised training and need a closer follow-up. So in other words, providing the right model of pulmonary rehab to the right patient at the right time. Okay, let's dive into the study now with that as the background. So the purpose of this study was to evaluate the safety, feasibility, and efficacy of a software-enabled in-home 8-week virtual unsupervised pulmonary rehab program and compare that with traditional in-clinic pulmonary rehab. And we hypothesized that there would be no difference between groups. And our intervention, so patients could self-select which group they wanted to be in, except for the subjects that were in the West Virginia group, because they had only a virtual only group. So the patient, basically the patients chose to either be in the virtual group or just not be in the study. And they completed a personalized exercise program 3 times a week, either at the clinic or at home. And they did the regular educational program, whether that was in the clinic program or the educational program via the app. And then in the virtual group, they got a phone call once a week. So there was no face-to-face interaction with the clinician and the patient after the initial evaluation, which was done in person. And then they would go home and do the program and get a phone call once a week. And then our outcomes are pre-post the 8-week program. And we used a t-test to compare the within group outcomes, and then we did an ANCOVA to compare between groups. So in terms of the clinic-based pulmonary rehab protocol, there were really no restrictions. They were just told to do what they normally do with their patients. So of course, the program is personalized for the patient, and their education and self-management training is done the way that they do it in the clinic. So each clinic has a slightly different way that they do those programs, and we didn't adjust that in any way for the study. In terms of the home-based program, I'll just show you a couple of quick slides of what the app looks like. So this is kind of the main dashboard of the app, and this is basically like a to-do list. So there's a daily action plan. It wasn't part of the study, but they could put in medications if they wanted to track their medications. And then there's tests and exercises and education of what they were supposed to do in this list. And this is what the educational tool looks like. So there's interactive elements. It's sort of a conversation between this clinician character and this kind of patient character. There's quizzes that have multiple choice questions that they can answer, and they're told whether or not the responses are correct or incorrect, and the correct response is reinforced. There's an avatar that guides them through the exercise program, and all of the parameters of the exercises can be controlled, from number of reps, time, the color of the TheraBand, the amount of weight, etc. All that's controlled by the clinician and progressed by the clinician. And then there's within the app, there's also a tool for them to be able to look at how their test scores changed over time. So in the case of the study, there's only 2, right? There's the baseline and the post-test. So, but this just shows what maybe if somebody were to continue using the tool, they could see their change over time during their maintenance phase. And then on the back end, the clinicians could see kind of a dashboard to see what their action plan outcomes are, how well they're adhering to the exercise program, and if they completed the educational components. So in terms of our inclusion and exclusion criteria, we included anyone over the age of 18 with a diagnosis of COPD. They haven't completed pulmonary rehab in the last 6 months. We got physician approval, and they needed to be able to walk independently with or without their assisted device, and complete their pulmonary function tests within the last year. And exclusion criteria are pretty typical of pulmonary rehab studies. So more than 4 liters of oxygen, active treatment of cancer, inability to stand or walk, neurological conditions, pain, no Wi-Fi in the home, or the physician told them not to exercise. So in terms of enrollment, we enrolled 48 subjects, 21 of them selected clinic-based pulmonary rehab, 27 selected virtual. I will mention that, this was started right at the height of COVID. So we expect that probably more people selected virtual potentially because of COVID, and also because I mentioned that West Virginia sites only enrolled people in virtual pulmonary rehab. And then we had 4 withdrawals in each group. So the data I'll show you today is from the 17 from the clinic and the 23 from the virtual group. So in terms of demographics, the population was made up of, folks in their late 60s, early 70s, mostly white, with a mix of male and female, and a slightly higher Charlson index in the in-clinic group. In terms of the FEV1, you can see there's a little bit of a difference here between the clinic and the virtual group, where there tended to be more people with a gold 2 in the virtual group, and a little bit more of a distribution in the clinic group. And then in terms of the baseline MMRC, there was also more in the virtual group that had a grade 1 compared to a bit more of a distribution in the clinic-based group. So one observation could be that people are self-selecting the virtual group also have slightly less disease impact. And perhaps the people who chose the clinic felt like because they were a bit more involved, maybe they needed and wanted that supervision. So in terms of our outcomes, both groups improved significantly in the 6-minute walk test. However, there were no differences between groups. And then I was really curious about the 6-minute walk test, since it's such a common outcome for pulmonary rehab. And so I wanted to look at the data a little bit more. So I just provide here for you. You can see that in the clinic group, that there was a significant increase in the large effect size, and that patients had about a 14% improvement over baseline in all, if I took all the patients together, and 59% achieved a minimal clinically important difference. And that's pretty similar to the virtual group. So there was a significant increase, had a medium effect size, 18% improvement over baseline, and 59% achievement MCID. I then was curious if we moved people out of that higher risk for increased mortality, meaning those people that walked less than 350 meters at baseline, did we move them into walking more than 350 meters by the time they followed up? And then those folks that walked less than 275 meters at baseline, could we kind of bump them up also into that lower mortality risk population? And you can see the numbers here. So there are 50% fewer of that group by 8 weeks. And that group also showed a 22% improvement over baseline in the clinic group. And half of the people that walked at less than 75 also had an increase of more than 30 meters at post-test. And the data is similar in our virtual group. So 36% fewer at the end of 8 weeks, 31% improvement over baseline, and 60% of those achieved a minimal clinically important difference. Our next outcome is the St. George. So here we also see that there was a significant improvement in both groups with medium effect sizes in both. And there's a really nice paper that asks, by how many points did they improve? And so if you improve by 4 points, that's considered an effective program. If you improve by 8 points, that's moderately effective. And if you improve by 12 points, that's very effective. And so you can see kind of the grouping here of how many people achieved this very effective improvement in St. George, 47% in the clinic and 30% in the virtual group. The link is helpful to clinicians, especially to help them inform where the patient might need some additional information about their disease. So again, both groups improved significantly Both had large effect sizes, with the vast majority of people reaching minimal clinically important difference. And I also looked at the subscores. So there's a disease, medication, self-management, exercise, and diet subscore. And you can see here that in many cases, there was a significant change even in the subscores, especially in the clinic-based group in terms of exercise and diet in the virtual group. And then in terms of the CAT, there were significant improvements in both groups, large effect size in the clinic, virtual had medium, and you can see that, majority of people also reached a minimal clinically important difference. When we looked between groups, and by the way, there's quite a few other outcomes that we did. Don't have the data for everything today, so just focusing on these outcomes. There were some outcomes that didn't show any difference so far in our analysis, things like the fall risk questionnaire or the time to up and go, things like that. There were no difference between groups. Sorry, there was no improvement in the 8 weeks, but also no difference between groups. And so then when we look at the between group differences using our ANCOVA, there were no statistically, no differences between groups. So both groups improved in a number of the outcomes during the 8 weeks, but that difference, that improvement wasn't better or worse in either of the groups. In terms of adherence to exercise, so both groups adhered pretty well. We wanted them to exercise at least 24 days, so 3 times a week over 8 weeks. And both groups exercised on average more than that, 31 days in the clinic and 32 in the virtual. In terms of the educational piece, so this is only the virtual group. We don't have the data for the clinic-based educational programs. So the way the app works is there's 12 lessons, and within each lesson, there's these short, like mini classes. So there's 41 of those, and then there's 14 quizzes. Took about 6 hours, 6.5 hours for the participants to complete all 12 lessons and quizzes. About 5 hours of that is class time or lesson time, and we had a 91% completion of all the lessons. In terms of the quizzes, those took about an hour to complete in total, and each quiz takes about 4 minutes to complete, and we had 92% completion of all quizzes. I mentioned to you before about the action plan. So we asked people to fill out the action plan daily. They didn't do that daily, but they didn't do so bad. They did 37 out of the 60 days. And what I was curious about is, did we see as they stayed longer in the program, was there a shift from maybe having more yellow and red days in the first 4 weeks to having fewer yellow and red days in the second 4 weeks? And we don't see a dramatic difference here. There are a few, a little bit more green days, slightly fewer yellow days, and fewer red days. And then I just calculated the total number of red days. So in the first 4 weeks, there were nine days where a participant scored in the red zone in the first 4 weeks, and there was 4 in the second 4 weeks. So I feel like there's maybe a little trend that people are spending more time having green days. But again, because they didn't fill it out every single day, we can't draw, too many conclusions. You may not fill it out on a day they're not feeling well. I wanted to kind of give an example of one subject and how this COPD action plan was useful. So this, I just recreated this is how the person did the, how many days they filled out the action plan within the app. And on this particular day, which is November 15th, they wrote, and this is a quote, they said, "I have not ventured out today other than to get the trash. Oxygen dropped to 84, usually doesn't go below 90. Didn't have any problems with exercise though, guess because of the cold wind and temperature." So that was a note that they put in after filling out the COPD action plan on the 15th. And then on the 16th, they score on the red zone. So they write, "Not having a good day, head stuffy, fever 100, joint aches, felt like I'm breathless, but I'm at 95 to 97. I feel tired, headache. I'm going to take a fever reducer, rest and sleep." And then the clinician came in and left the note that, she contacted the patient and basically asked him to call his doctor. And they ended up putting him on hold for the study for 7 days till the symptoms resolved. And then the next 2 days, they go into the yellow zone and then they're back to the green zone. So I just offer this as an example of how the COPD action plan was used by the clinician to help monitor the patients during the study. In terms of safety and feasibility, so we didn't have, we had one hospitalization that was someone who had an appendectomy. There was no acute exacerbations of COPD. There was one flare-up that occurred, no falls, and no other study-related adverse events. In terms of feasibility, there were some folks that did have issues with Wi-Fi. Sometimes that was Wi-Fi problems at the clinic, and sometimes that was Wi-Fi problems at home. There were some tablet-related issues, so there was a delay in getting someone a tablet, and that was they were going to start the program right before the holidays, and then decided, because there was a delay in getting the tablet, that they ended up actually not even starting the program, just dropping out. Sometimes there were issues with software updates, and actually one of our participants found a bug for us, which we fixed. And then we use the system usability scale to measure usability. And so this, you can see what the scores were at the beginning. We're in the 50s and 60s, that we have them score it right after they do their initial evaluation. And then you can see what the scores bumped up to by the end of the 8 weeks. So we can see that there's a little bit of a learning curve on how to use the app, but by the end, our goal was always to be above 65. And we were pretty close to that at baseline, but we definitely achieved that by the end of their 8 weeks. So that's sort of the end of the data from the study, but I wanted to just close with 3 or 4 more slides, and then I'm happy to take questions and talk through this. But I wanted to just mention that a lot of times people ask, well, how do we use this with our current program? And there's ways to use a virtual tool or a software supported tool, even with your clinic-based programs. So if you're only doing clinic and no virtual or no telehealth at all, you can still offer for patients to use the tablet and do exercises on, say, days when they're not coming to the clinic, or if for some reason, like in West Virginia and North Carolina, there's a lot of inclement weather during the winter, and also people travel. And so, if they're in an 8-week pulmonary rehab program, this could be a way to help them to continue the program even when they're traveling. It could also be used with a hybrid model where patients can begin, say, for example, coming to the clinic 2 to 3 times a week, then move to once or twice a week with the alternate days being done virtually, and then eventually moving to all virtual prior to discharge. And that would help them to potentially be more adherent to, say, a maintenance phase. An alternative hybrid model too could be where, especially if the clinic's really busy or if there's a long wait list, you could offer to have them do their educational piece via the app, and then come to the clinic mostly for their exercise, and potentially have more people join in the clinic for the exercise piece. And then, of course, the third model is the purely virtual model, where the patients would attend one pre-program evaluation in person, and then all of the other sessions are done at home. And in the study, the clinicians said that their weekly phone calls usually lasted 10 to 15 minutes, and that they use that to discuss their progress, discuss any educational issues if they had questions about, what they were learning, and also to progress the program. And so this is potentially a model that uses the remote therapeutic monitoring codes for reimbursement. And so I just thought I'd walk through, so going back to the beginning, that Lindenauer paper where he looked at, 197,000 Medicare beneficiaries and found that only 1.5% got pulmonary rehab within the first 90 days. And yet that's a really important time frame to receive pulmonary rehab. So I offer this as a post-exacerbation model where, the person's admitted to the hospital, but before discharge, they're given the app. It's a tablet loaded with the app, or they can use their own personal device. And they're provided education both to the patient as well as the caregiver if possible. They can be evaluated to determine what their functional capacity is and create a virtual pulmonary rehab program that they could start right away when it's appropriate upon discharge. And then also educate the caregiver and the patient on the expectations. So with remote therapeutic monitoring, they have to have 16 logins within 30-day period. And that those logins, excuse me, have to transmit data. So it's not just logging in, but actually doing something within the program. I have to do that 16 out of 30 days. So it's really important that the patient understands that. And then also, just determining the frequency of follow-up calls and establishing some sort of schedule. And once you've done that education, you can bill for the 98975 code. And patient can be discharged home, and then they complete their program. And so this little graphic here is really just to show, the days that the person exercised is the little circles. The colored boxes are the days where they've done an action plan. All of that counts as data coming through. And then, of course, they also do the educational piece. And so if the patient does, in fact, complete this type of intervention, then you can bill the 98976 code. And then for every 20 minutes that you spend monitoring, so that means looking at the dashboard, updating their program, and it also includes being on the phone with them. The first 20 minutes you can bill the 98980, and the second 20 minutes 98981. So in this case, there's 40-ish minutes of monitoring, and that would result in generating revenue of about $130. So if we look at that from the perspective of a clinic, again, these are those same codes that I mentioned before. These are the 30 days. This is the 20 minutes. If you dedicated one FTE, so this is not quite a full-time FTE, but pretty close, one FTE to monitoring 200 patients at 40 minutes a patient. So that's there's enough minutes in the months, so to speak, that one FTE could do that. Then that potentially could generate upwards of $26,000 a month in new revenue, or over $300,000 a year in new revenue. And then also those patients, there's other potential, revenue for sites, being that there could be referrals to other disciplines, just essentially based on what the clinician is observing and learning about the patient during that 8-week or a 12-week program. And then I'm not, trying to say every type of business model here, but there would be different business models for, say, ACO REACH programs or Medicare Advantage programs. And so I mentioned before that Chris Mosier, his paper indicated that in the first year, after the first year of post-hospitalization, if the person gets pulmonary rehab, that there's about an $8,000 cost savings. And a lot of times people say, well, maybe virtual is not as good as clinic-based, or maybe, the clinic is the best. We all agree to that. But let's just say it was half as good. Maybe there's still a $4,000 savings. So, I think that it's still a reasonable option, especially with right now, we're only reaching that 1.5%. So I'll just close back with the slide that I started with, just discussing, like, is the virtual, the option, the telehealth, supervised or unsupervised, but is that us removing this fence for our patients so that they can come and get pulmonary rehab and, earn the benefit of receiving that care. And that's all I had. Thank you so much for the opportunity. I'm happy to take questions or discuss.
Thank you so much, Cheryl. And we're so grateful to have you back here to present on these results, and so much great information that you gathered from it. And I know you said it's still ongoing, but This was wonderful. So thank you so much. We'll open it up for any questions, comments for Cheryl, and you're welcome to chat in or unmute. Dr. Stansbury, I see you unmuted there.
Yeah, do you know what the updated pulmonary rehab guidelines are going to say? I know they should be coming out soon regarding the virtual and remote rehab.
So I was at ATS this year and they presented those updates. And they have a recommendation for telehealth. Yeah. And I know there's a lot of confusion around telehealth and billing. Telehealth was extended for physical therapists through the end of 24, December 31st of 2024. Physical therapists can still bill for telehealth. So if the pulmonary rehab program is being run by a PT, that's not a problem in terms of billing telehealth codes. But the remote therapeutic monitoring codes are still available to everyone. So the way that it would work, if it was a respiratory therapist, they would bill under the physician and PI. So there'd be a discount, for that, but those still are codes. I've called our local MAC here in Los Angeles to confirm that. And the answer is yes. Everyone that I've talked to has said that it's not a problem for folks to use the remote therapeutic monitoring codes. That's what they're there for.
Thank you so much for the question, Dr. Stansbury, and answering that, Cheryl. Any other questions, comments from the group? A long echo pause. Luann, thank you for chatting in. Luann chatted in asking you, Cheryl, what would the codes be that you mentioned?
Oh, let me put that slide back up. So these are the codes: 98975, 98976, 80, and 81. And this is the general reimbursement. So every MAC is going to be slightly different, either slightly above this. I think this number actually goes up to maybe $55 or $60 for some of the more expensive MACs. And same thing with these reimbursement, you can, depending on where you live and what your MAC reimburses, these numbers change slightly, but this is the MAC equals 0 reimbursement.
Thank you so much for sharing those again. Luann also said thank you.
Do any of you all do telehealth or remote pulmonary rehab at your sites? I'm curious.
Yeah, that's a good question. I feel like some of you do from previous sessions. I vaguely remember Dr. Doyle mentioning something about that, but yeah, you can do the raised hand feature if you do any virtual aspect.
We do a lot of telemedicine visits, WVU. We haven't gotten into the telehealth pulmonary rehab space, but it seems like there's a lot of companies out there very interested in supporting that right now. So it's certainly a growing market. I feel like I get multiple emails every day about it.
Yeah, there's kind of two models I feel like that I've seen out there. One where some companies will sort of say, hey, we'll take your patients and we'll provide the pulmonary rehab for you, and they do it via a telehealth or like a group class. They still provide really individualized training within that group. And I've seen a lot of those have focused a lot on the exercise piece, which is obviously a really key piece for pulmonary rehab. But it seems like it's a little bit less on the education and, kind of self-management piece. And then the kind of approach that we've taken and others where it's completely virtual. So, there's no class to sign up for, and there's no, kind of do it on your own time. Some of the research that I presented, in some of those models, people were provided with like a cycle ergometer or a treadmill, but in other studies, they weren't provided with any like really specialized equipment, other than maybe like TheraBands, and ankle weights or hand weights or something. And that's the model that we've used also, where really we just encourage people to go walking. That was what the study exercise encouraged. Of course, if they had access to a stationary bike or something, they could do whatever their exercise was, and the clinician could individualize that for them. But yeah.
Luann, I see you raised
And I
your
think the
hand.
new the ACO REACH models, where they're really looking at increasing that equity, accessibility, and community health. That's what REACH stands for. They're really interested in making sure that people can get access to the care that they need so they stay healthy. So I think there's real opportunities too for health systems to contract with them to provide that program. And we know that, the clinic-based programs, obviously that's the best option, but between few clinics and wait lists and all the other challenges that we know we have with our clinic-based program, and the reimbursement, which I know that's being worked on. So hopefully the reimbursement will get improved if bills can pass through Congress. But yeah, I just think there's, even if we had the best reimbursement and all the other things, were perfect, we still have 97% of people who aren't going. So, giving another option, I think, is really key.
Yeah, I mean, I kind of talked to Dr. Doyle about this. This was a few months ago. I was kind of surprised I saw his name there, because, we thought this was almost like a no-brainer for our sort of rural dwelling patients. He kind of described it as being helpful, but not a magic bullet. Like, it's not going to fix a lot of the problems still, but I was kind of surprised he said that, actually, because it seems like a no-brainer. This would really help give rural people access. I kind of wish he was on so he could kind of expound on what he told us a little bit more. But
yeah, for me, I think it boils down to the right patient and the right model, right? So it may be that you start off with kind of that hybrid model that I described. So for some patients, like we actually had one study participant who selected the virtual group, and then she got home from her initial evaluation session and she called the clinic and she said, what, I don't know what I was thinking. I know I'm not going to be motivated to do this on my own. I've got to switch and come to the clinic, because that's the only way I know that I'm going to do it. And so we switched her to the clinic-based group, and then she never showed. So, I think that there's going to be people that, the virtual is just not going to work. And there's going to be people that the clinic's not going to work. I mean, we already have that. We had 97% that for some reason the clinic's not working.
yeah.
So, and then, we can talk too about the maintenance phase, right? Like, we know that if people don't continue doing what they've learned in their program, then it just drops off after about a year. But Ann Holland's group showed that even the unsupervised, just knowing that someone is monitoring them in the background, seemed to keep them going enough that, they had significantly fewer hospitalizations than the group that got nothing. And so to me, that's the nice thing also about these remote therapeutic monitoring codes. They don't end at the end of 8 weeks. You can keep billing them as long as it's medically necessary. So it's not the same as the telehealth codes or the clinic codes, obviously, regular clinic reimbursement codes.
Questions, comments from the group?
I was going to say, I work with Cabin Creek Health, and so we were one of the sites that worked with Cheryl. in regards to the Blue Marble app. And of course, we're very rural. A lot of our sites, we have 5 different ones, and they're in very rural communities. So we thought it would be fantastic for them to have ones to have this option, because they can't come to the DAWS site when they live 45 minutes away or an hour from where they're at, or even more, depending on whether they're in Sissonville or Clendenin. The problem then is, because they're rural, a lot of them didn't have very sketchy Wi-Fi, or didn't know or aren't confident with electronic devices. So we would offer it, but so many declined for reasons such as that. So where we have found that some of it it has to be the motivated person, because I'm also that way. If I'm left to my own demise, I don't quite function as well as if I'm in person at a gym or something. But what we're finding now is there's a lot of people that can come in person 1 day a week, but can't come twice for taking care of family or work situations. So we are kind of keeping a mental and written down list of patients that are saying that, so that we're investigating more about continuing with an app. That's why I wanted to, and I'm sorry, we start with patients early this morning, and I went, oh no, we've got to, so I missed that first slide. I'm glad you guys record that, and I screen printed it so that we can use for patients such as that, because if they're motivated enough to come once in person, I think they're really going to be good candidates to at least try for the other visits.
Yeah, I think that's a really good point. And the Wi-Fi issue is a real issue, and the competency with technology, those are real issues. And I think that one of the things that Chris Mosier's paper showed us was that he was saying that even if each session went up to a cost of $171, you're still getting a benefit. And so he and I were talking, I don't know, it's probably a year ago now, where even if you provided the tablet and the Wi-Fi, so you just eliminate the Wi-Fi as an issue, you're still coming out with a cost savings. An insurance company is still coming out with a cost savings for those folks. And that also could include potentially offering the transportation to bring them to the clinic once a week. Like there's so many, because the cost savings is over $8,000, you can still provide a lot of other resources and buttressing to support that patient, to try to help them. And then the digital literacy, clearly that's a challenge. What some folks have done is they have kind of like a digital navigator that they make available to the patient, so that if they have any difficulties with like navigating with the technology, that there's someone that they can call, which is not the clinician. It's not, it's not that person's role, but more of a kind of a digital navigator type support for them. But those are definitely real issues, and it's hard to overcome those. But the good news is that's not everybody, right? There's still plenty of patients out there that don't have either of those issues, or only have one of the two.
I'm glad there's an option, so that if somebody says it's a transportation issue, but maybe they have internet and are computer literate and very confident with that, then there's that option for them. So it's nice to have both in our pocket to help our patients with.
Yeah.
Thank you all so much. We have just a few minutes left of the session. So any final comments or questions?
I'll say that if anybody's interested in trialing our platform or piloting our platform, please let me know. We're happy to kind of go a deeper dive with you and show you some more of the ins and outs of the whole thing. And I missed that.
Oh no, that would be awesome. That's great. Thank you, Cheryl. And anyone who wants to get in contact with Cheryl, you can always email me as well. I'll make sure to connect the two of you. But That would be great, Cheryl. Thank you so much for today's session, presenting all that information. And if there's any follow-up to the study or anything that you would like to come back to an echo session and present on, you're always welcome. So thank you so much. And thank you all so much for joining as well. I was hoping to do a very quick poll, should take no more than a minute or two. So it just helps us get some feedback and make sure we cater these sessions to you all. So I'll go ahead and do that. Is everyone able to see the poll? Great, see some heads nodding. And the only announcement that I have is next session will be on August 21st. And Dr. Stansbury, we have you down for presenting on the best of ATS. So if that changes, you're always welcome to send me an updated topic or anything you'd like. So no pressure on keeping that topic, but thank you so much. We'll see you all next time.